Welcome back. My name's Callie. I'm the Okayest Engineer, and we are on video 4 of a series where we're building a custom carbon fiber seat from start to finish for my experimental helicopter. In the first 3 videos, we designed and manufactured a foam plug. We reinforced that foam plug and got it ready for the mold making process. Finally made that mold, and we are here ready to start the carbon fiber layup. I cannot wait. It's going to be a lot of fun. It's always a good idea to put down your tacky tape when you know your mold is as clean as possible. In this case, it was right after I applied 6 coats of Pardal paste mold release. You can put down your tacky tape and leave the outer film on it to protect it during the layup process, but this way you know that there's no contaminants between your tape and your mold that could sneak up and create a leak further down the road. We're finally to the point of laying down some carbon. So to cut carbon, you actually just pull a single strand out. It gives you a nice straight line, and then you can follow that with the scissors to cut your pieces. For this layup, we're going to attempt to do a chevron seam in the middle of the seat. This requires the first layer of carbon to have an extremely straight edge, and it usually requires some sort of backing material to hold the carbon from fraying or doing anything bad. In this case, I found a technique online where you can basically just spray down some spray adhesive onto the non-mold surface side of the carbon, let it set for about half hour to gas off, and that should hold everything together. I had my nephew come over and help me with this next part that required more than just 2 hands. We're using this 2-inch piece of blue tape just to give us a reference line for the middle of the part. This will give us something that we can butt the edge of the carbon up to and hopefully give us that straight line that we're looking for.
We don't want to push this tight onto the mold, we just want it to basically rest on it. Oh, that was pretty much perfect.
I'm lightly dusting the mold surface with some more spray adhesive. You want to be careful not to use too much because this can actually show through on the part when it's finished. But I did want something there at least to hold the carbon sturdy enough while we put on the subsequent layers.
And the goal is line it, yep, we're going to try and line it up the best we can. You have enough on your side to go to the very bottom?
Yeah, I got more than
all right. Lift back up a little bit. Alright, guide it.
That's pretty much on.
Alright, you do your side, I'll do mine. Perfect. Let's go, dude.
Is this the first try?
First try.
Yeah, this looks good.
Now that the first edge is done, all that's left to do on this first layer is just to conform it to the rest of the mold. And the most difficult part is done. For the next piece of carbon, you actually have to turn it over so the weave goes in the opposite direction and you get that desired V pattern that we're looking for. You want about an inch overlap in the middle and make sure that there's no stray carbon strands that are stuck underneath the carbon fiber that will be on the mold surface and ruin the look of your part. And finally, a quick prayer to the carbon gods, and if you're lucky, it'll look good when you pull it out of the mold. So I'm definitely learning as I go, but I wanted to show you what I came across as I was trying to get this carbon to contour over this complex kind of geometry. I should have known better, but as you can tell, all the carbon strands, mainly going in the long direction, started to buckle, and then it got all crinkly, and basically it's going to make the surface of the part and the subsequent layers not look that great. So on the other side, after I screwed up this side, I decided I was going to try to just cut it. And so it'll leave basically a seam line in the part, but you can tell that I don't have all that buckling and crinkling and everything going on in that location. Hindsight, I probably should have just done that on the actual surface layer. But hey, this is my first try. So we'll see how it turns out, and if I hate it, then I've got the mold so I can make another one. But just wanted to point that out real quickly as I encountered it, and I think the next time we'll do it a little bit different. The rest of the buildup layers are pretty straightforward. You don't really have to be too careful other than making sure you're not messing up the layers underneath. You can use plenty of spray adhesive to hold everything together. Hindsight, I probably would have used fewer layers of heavier cloth instead of the 4 layers of the 200 gram that I already had. And the final thing to do is to trim all the excess carbon on the flange of the mold. That way it's not getting into the tacky tape and you have enough room to get your vacuum bag sealed properly. The layup for the seat's going to be as follows. I'm using 200 gram 3K carbon 2x2 tweel. We'll use 4 layers, mainly because I didn't order enough and I hope it's going to be fine. But 4 layers of carbon. That gets followed up with peel ply. This is a breather cloth that basically is easy to pull off the carbon once all the resin is cured and leaves a really nice surface that you can actually bond to. That peel ply must cover all of your carbon or bad things will happen. Then this is a flow media. This allows the resin to flow through the part and gives it kind of like some passageways to get through. If you don't have this, carbon infusion won't work because it doesn't have, it'll be too much resistance for that resin to flow through the part. That'll go over the entire part again. On the resin side, I'm using a 1/4 inch tube, 3/8 OD with a 1/4 inch T. This is 1/8 inch just spiral tubing. This will give a path for the resin to flow down through the part. That gets placed on top of the flow media. If you don't put it on top of the flow media, then you're defeating the purpose and it can't get from your spiral tube to the flow media to flow through your part. So they'll get placed there. And then the other side, I'll just probably put another T on my vacuum hose to create the vacuum and will flow from one side of the part to the other. We'll be using this vacuum pump for this part today. You can find the build video for this vacuum pump in the description, but basically it's a Amazon 2-stage rotary vane pump with a controller that I made for it to make life a little easier. And it comes into a resin trap. The resin trap is something that you want in line. So if any resin comes out of your part, it goes into the cup and doesn't find its way into your actual vacuum pump, which would be a bad day. So the reason I have the smaller ones is they have acrylic tops. The larger ones, I think like the gallon size ones, come with glass tops, and they only come with one hole, which is not ideal for a resin trap. You don't want resin going into your gauge or through into your pump. You really need something that drops your resin into something you can catch it in, and then the vacuum pump being completely isolated. So these have acrylic tops, and I was able to basically put this fitting in here. I saw this on an Easy Composites resin trap, super cool. It's a cord grip, or like a electrical cord grip, and there's a rubber fitting in here that makes a perfect seal against a 1/4 inch hose. So you can easily insert and remove that hose and run it down into your cup. And so perfect seal, once again, super easy install, makes it super user-friendly to use. And so once again, modified this cheap little resin trap to do that for me. The layer of peel ply is now going down over the carbon. It does not conform to geometry very well, so you'll see I'm making a whole bunch of relief cuts and folding it back on itself. I am using, once again, the spray adhesive to hold everything down. You want to try and get this to lay as flat as possible on the carbon, so you end up with a nice surface once this is all finished. It's okay to overlap and to add extra pieces, but just make sure that 100% of the carbon is covered before you move to the next step. The flow media is slightly more difficult than even the peel ply. It doesn't conform very well. You can't really hold it down with anything like spray adhesive, and so you're left with duct tape. Duct tape's totally fine to use. I could have probably actually used more. It's also perfectly acceptable to use multiple pieces and just make sure that they're taped together. The spiral tubing is next. This is where the resin is actually introduced to the part. You want to make sure that it's laying on top of the flow media and that the distance between the spiral tubing or to the exit is no more than 500 millimeters. And last but not least, the vacuum bag. I'm not going to go into too much detail about how all of this is done. There's a whole lot of great tutorials on easycomposites.com. I'd encourage you to go check those out there.
I'm hoping this will just provide a little bit of context about what worked and what didn't in my experience.
Well, I ended up picking a pretty horrible pleat to show you how to do this because this one's quite small. But basically, you end up getting a piece of gum tape that is slightly bigger than what your pleat will be. And I usually leave the backside still on. And what you're gonna end up doing, sometimes it's easier to fold it back over on itself to sneak it into the hole. But you're gonna put the new gum tape slightly ahead of the bag, then you're gonna roll it around the bag and then pinch it back on itself. And so I'm gonna see if I can do this right the first time. So we're gonna place the tail just before the pleat. We're gonna run it up in, and it's okay if it kind of squeezes over there. We'll run it in. We're gonna be careful not to get any wrinkles between the bag and the gum tape. We're gonna get it all the way around. Like that. So now you got a little wave going on. And then you're gonna peel your back off. Sorry for such the small pleat. And then we're gonna run the other side into it. It doesn't usually close all the way, but I mismeasured the tape. But then you can close this gap out. And usually it's nice to just squeeze it against your mold down flat. Make sure you get all the seams really nice. And then you can take it off and squeeze it the other way. And make sure that there's nowhere for the air to go. And that is a pleat, a small one, albeit. That's what a normal one would look like, but this bag's pretty simple, so it should be okay. All right, and now's the time we find out if we did this right. So what we're gonna do, we have our line that would go into our resin pot over here. We have the vacuum line over here. We're gonna throw that into our resin trap, which is connected to the vacuum pump. We're gonna pull this vacuum down, make sure the bag gets all situated, and then we'll do a leak test. So before we do that, we're not gonna put resin in here. We're gonna clamp this line off with a little line clamp. That'll keep this side from pulling any air, like that. And then the other side we'll throw into this resin trap. You want to make sure that the lines that go both into your resin cup and into your resin trap, you cut them at an angle. That way they won't suck to the bottom of the resin cup and they won't trap anything. So just a little tip there, throw a little cut, a diagonal cut on the end of your hose, and then we're gonna suck this down. All right, we're gonna stop periodically to make sure that the bag is seating properly. You wanna make sure where those pleats are, like this is a line from a pleat. We want this down in this radius. So I'm gonna move this pleat down to the radius. That way it has something to pull into and the bag won't create a void. So we'll move these pleats over. Make sure the pleat on this side is doing the same thing. And then the other thing, since it's so complex, we want to make sure that the flow media is also seating properly. It'll kind of stretch into where it needs to go, but you at least want it started off in the right direction to make sure everything's going to work right. All right, instead of having you guys sit through everything that I just did, I figured we'd just fast forward and I'll show you where we're at right now. We did get the pump to pull down to about 28.5 inches of mercury. So that's where we are now. We're doing a leak down test. And while it's quiet, let's check out the part. So you can see here we're 28.3 inches. So we'll see how that falls. I don't have the part isolated from the pump, but I've done a leak down on the pump and it doesn't leak. I'll probably do one more check. We'll clamp this off here either tonight or tomorrow and just do one more check. But anyway, it's leaking down. I'll show you the proper way to do that here in a minute. You can see here the pleats are nice and down in the radius, so everything is good there. It did pull in nicely. I'm a little concerned where the flow media is creased. I'm not sure if that will like have an imprint on the part. I know if you run your spirals across the middle of a thin part, it could actually do an imprint, so you might see it on the other side. I'm guessing that might as well too. But I've already made a few mistakes and I'll probably end up redoing this again. So we're learning and we'll find out. One of you guys will probably tell me in the comments, but I'll probably know before then anyways. So yeah, everything's good there. You can see actually over here, the flow media stretched a little bit. I think that's going to be okay. It'll flow a little bit slower through that area, but it's still going to be just fine. And then lastly, I guess we'll just talk about the pleats. It's a pretty simple part. So there's basically just 2 pleats on each corner. That's to run a seam this way and run a seam that way. Once again, just to kind of hug in these little valleys that I got going on. So pretty good part. The other thing I was trying to make sure as it sank or sucked down is to make sure that these overlaps didn't walk. You can see it got a little close here. I was a little worried, but we still have coverage. So that should be just fine. And then last, this I saw from Easy Composites. I think they call it a resin trap or something, or a break. But basically you put your vacuum a little bit further away from your media so that it slows down significantly once it gets closer to your vacuum side, so you're not pulling a whole bunch of resin into your reservoir, and hopefully it has the rest of the part can kind of catch up if things are ahead. I'm a little close on this side, so once I'll pull the pressure back out and kind of just wiggle this over in this direction, get a little bit more centered, but that should work just fine too. So yeah, a lot of work, but I think it's going to work, and we'll see how things go. We're down to 28.2, so we've lost, 0.2 of an inch of mercury in the last couple minutes, so I think we're going to be okay. So yeah, next up is start Infusion. So the proper way to do a leak down test, I pulled the part all the way down as far as the pump would go, or about 28.5 inches of mercury there. I turned it off. You clamp it right at the part. I've let it sit for about a half hour. And then now I'm going to turn the pump back on, pull the trap down to as far as the pump will go. I'll turn it back off. We'll release this clamp. And if we see any change in that gauge or my digital gauge over there, that means that there's a leak in the part and that needs to be fixed. That's not going to pull anymore. So then we will release this and we'll watch the gauge. Basically no drop. No drop at all. And that's still at 28.5. So I think it's safe to say that there's no leak in the bag. So any leak down I'm getting is from the resin trap on. There's a formula for predicting the amount of epoxy you'll need based on your layup, and I'll link that in the description. It came directly from Easy Composites. I mixed up 2 batches of epoxy and ended up pausing the infusion halfway through as the first bucket ran out. I ended up using a very slow hardener for this epoxy resin. The main reason was it can't hurt to have more time for the layup, and the mechanical properties are basically the exact same, whether you use the slow or the medium, so I just chose the slow for that reason. It says for a 24-hour cure, but it's really important to come down and take your resin feed line that's going into your part and try to break it. You should get a really nice clean break in the line before you try to remove your part. In my instance, it took almost 2 days as opposed to 1 day to fully cure and get to this point. But if you take your part out before you get these breaks in your lines, basically you could end up with a scrap part and it'll flop all over the place. The vacuum bag came off fairly easily, but the tacky tape not so much. A tip I saw online was to cut the peel ply every 3 or 4 inches or so, and that would make removal slightly easier.
Kinda.
There we go. It's at this point I realized I probably should have been wearing gloves. The thin layer of epoxy in these sheets ended up tearing my hands apart. Well, it was a little harder to get the peel ply and flow media off the part than I expected, but it did ultimately come off. It was hard down in these radii. I think there was a little bit more resin down here. Plus, I had the overlap between the flow media. There was 2 layers of that around basically the whole perimeter, so I think that just made things a little more difficult. But regardless, got it all off. I did break the part loose while I was pulling it all off, which is a good thing. I mean, it released from the mold. I did my best not to look because I wanted to wait until the end. So here we go. See if I can get this thing out. And here we are. I mean, for a first try, not too bad. I mean, there is some flaws. I noticed those when we were laying down the carbon. It didn't go down the way that I had hoped, and I basically knew some of this was going to happen. So not a big deal there. I did learn a lot in the process, so I think if I were to do this again, I could figure out and make it go even better. But that just comes with trial and error, right? I was curious though, and it looks like I can see it. Yeah, so you can see these, I guess, seams, I'll call them. This was anywhere in the flow media where it had a crinkle. I kind of anticipated you'd see a witness on that on the inside of the part, and turns out, yeah, you can. It's pretty prevalent kind of here, and there's a couple more around here. I think all that means, well, I think the way it's there is it creates a bridge, and that bridge in the flow media prevents the vacuum from pushing down on the part evenly, normally, through the whole surface. And so you end up with, I think, like resin rich, they call it, resin rich locations where those creases are. So the next time I do this, I'll have to be a lot more careful in making sure that those, the flow media, wherever it overlaps or anywhere that it's not smooth, it lays down flat. Otherwise, you will get these kind of witness marks where that happens. So I'll take note of that. The seam in the middle, I mean, turned out really great. I can't complain about that. Super straight line, not bad for not knowing what the heck I was doing and just using basically spray adhesive to keep all the fibers together. So that worked out well. I think, yeah, and this was the first side. I think this looks a little more dull than this side. I can only assume that was from maybe throwing down that spray adhesive, which clouded up probably the part. So maybe next time I'll use a little less spray adhesive or try to be a little more careful. It's really not that bad. So, I mean, I could live with it, but just trying to point out things that I've noticed. Outside of that, I mean, it's pretty great. It's really light. I ended up using 4 plies because unfortunately that's all I ordered. I didn't order enough. I planned on 6, but decided to give it a shot anyways. I mean, it's a little flimsy in the torsion direction, super stiff kind of in that direction. but I still think it's sufficient enough to hold my body weight. I'll sit on it here in a little bit. We'll go ahead and get a weight just because I'm also curious how much this thing weighs. So we'll get this thing turned on. I'll give it to you in grams and in American units that everyone else understands. So in grams, we're at about 860, and then in freedom units, we're about 1 pound, 14 ounces. So, I mean, yeah, it's light. It looks way heavier than it is. If I do it again, I'll probably do a couple more layers. I might put some core material in just to give it a little more stiffness, but I think this will work for now. It'll tell me if it's the right size for the helicopter once I pick that up, which should be here in like 2 weeks. I'll get the whole airframe, so that's exciting. So I'll at least get it test fitted in. I'll trim it all out. I'll make it pretty. Not bad for a first try. Still got the mold. I've got some extra material, so making new parts is going to be real short order, super easy to do. And I've learned a bunch, so stoked. To trim the part, I lined it with some just 2-inch blue tape and then used a permanent marker to Sharpie a line where I wanted to cut it. And then I used a little, I think the Patey's call it a chugga chugga tool, which is basically a reciprocating cutter. And that seemed to do quick work for the carbon. And that's going to do it for this series of building a carbon fiber seat right down here in my basement for my helicopter. It has been one heck of a journey, longer than I could have ever anticipated, but you know what? I couldn't have asked for a better first try, better part. Sure, there's some flaws, but we've learned a whole lot, and that's just fine. It tells a story. I hope you follow along. Join us. The fuselage is coming in the next probably 2 to 3 weeks. We'll go ahead and test fit this in there, and then the real fun begins. As always, never stop learning, go build something cool, and we'll see you on the next one.